fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
Another thing that got me in like a weird headspace was the book I read recently. This was a really good one. I had this for a while, and I held off on reading it because I had other stuff that really piqued my interest a bit more, and it was just on my shelf, and I got it for kind of cheap. It's a well-known book, and it turned out to be one of the most illuminating books that I've read recently, and it has a lot of applications in other areas. Let me just grab it quickly. This is a military book. The book is titled On Killing. It's written by Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman. So, On Killing, the Psychological Cost of Learning to Kill in War and Society. And this is a pretty famous book. It came out not long ago. So this is from a military man, a man with real combat experience and real prestige in the organization. I don't know if do you call the military an organization? You're not supposed to, right?
Yeah, well, it is.
It is, right? Yeah, we're gonna. It's about killing, like what the impact that killing someone has on the human mind, what it takes to get someone to kill, and the tactics you would do to get a regular person to kill, and how people truly behave in combat, from not only an anecdotal level but also a scientific level. And the good thing about something like this is there's a lot of research in this sort of thing. There's a lot of evidence, because throughout time, even going back to Rome, like not only just the Napoleonic Wars, but going back to Rome, there's lots of written evidence about how to do combat well. And there's a lot of documented evidence of, like, here's what the generals thought, here's problems they ran into with troop morale. So these lessons about how to get soldiers to do what you want, like it's one of the most well documented things in history. So if you're into military history, there's probably more data just on that than any other field, even in general science. Like there's weird stuff, there's stuff that was lost, but we know a lot about troop formations and how to train guys to take a life in combat. But so it's told from a historical perspective, but also a modern perspective. That's why I love the book. It's a pretty girthy book as well. I'd recommend people read this. And it's written in a very matter-of-fact way, so it's not a lot of flowery, poetic language. But he starts about talking about how the human mind in general responds to killing. And he makes certain caveats in here. So he will say that we're going to talk about the average person. Now, there are people in society that are more predisposed to killing. There are psychopaths who just feel nothing about killing, or like killing. They actually don't see it, and they enjoy the process of doing it. And these people are in the military. So he will say that they're not only just serial killers, but they can find an active role in the military. And he says that a lot of these people tend to rise into commando units, or units that ambush people. So, the people who excel in combat, who are really okay with killing, tend to be filtered into areas where they have to do that more often. These are the people who will actually, like, any kind of ambush is like this, to kill not a defenseless person, but kill someone from behind, or kill someone where you're convinced they're not directly attacking you. Like, they'll get usually actual psychopaths to do that. And then there's all kinds of people who are predisposed to doing it. And there's ways to get people used to it. But we'll start with the psychological stuff, because I found this really interesting. I never really thought of it like this before.
Lieutenant Colonel Dave Grossman, you've written an engrossing book on killing and the psychological costs of killing. It was Hobbes who said that the nature of man in nature is brutish, cruel, and short. The whole notion being that man has a built-in instinct to kill and be aggressive. Having conducted literally hundreds of interviews with military personnel who have killed on the battlefield, you come away with a far different conclusion about man's inherent nature vis-a-vis extinguishing another person's life.
Every species has this built-in resistance to killing their own kind. Animals with antlers and horns fight one another in a harmless fashion, slamming head to head, but against anyone else they go to the side and gut and gore. Piranha turn their teeth on anything and everything, but they fight each other with flicks of the tail. If you didn't have this, your territorial and mating battles would destroy the species. Mankind appears to have a similar resistance built into him. However, we're extremely efficient at overcoming this resistance.
And he starts with the statement that you hear a lot of people say this, that a fight or flight response, right? You'll say, people will feel that, like, I'm in a situation where my life is threatened and I have a fight or flight response. He said that doesn't really exist. He said there's actually 4 responses. He says fight or flight happens when you're dealing with a threat that is not from your own species. So fight or flight will often, if it's a snake, if it's a bear, if it's something that you don't understand, you either fight it or you flight it or flight it. Shut up. But he says when you're dealing with another human or you're dealing with another person within your same species, and animals do this as well, there's actually 4. There's fight, flight, posture, or submit. And this is important. This is the foundation of what he talks about a lot. So if you're dealing with another person and it's a threat, you can either fight or you can run away, or you can do posturing. And even like bears do this, reptiles do this, where they make a threat, a physical threat. They make themselves big, they make themselves scary, or they roar, or they stand a certain way. And that posturing is how one way it's kind of like a fight, but not really. And then typically what will happen then is you pick the other one, which is submit. And submitting is saying all of these are to avoid a fight, essentially. And the argument is that any organization of animals has typically internally evolved this, and each one's different in how they do this, but they internally evolve it to avoid a fight. And rarely, even if there is a conflict or a fight within a system, most of the time no one's killed. Now, sometimes this is different with monkeys because monkeys are just fucked up. But even like, again, bears, horses, lions, anything, even if there's a fight, it's not to the death. Sometimes if it's an alpha, maybe if it's like a hierarchy fight, but most animals will go to any lengths to avoid killing one of their own. And the premise of the book is that is evident even in combat. And that's really, really interesting. And he will point to even back in the times of Rome and Greece, they had a hard time getting soldiers to kill each other, even if they were from an opposing army. One example he gave was, even if you have a sword or a spear, what people like to do is slash. They like to slash defensively. No one actually likes piercing with a sword. And there was evidence of they had to train their soldiers to actually pierce because that was fatal. Where slashing, you can wound, you can maim, you can get them to go away, you can inflict them enough harm to make them run away, which is kind of what you want them to do. And he said, traditionally, and we know this is basic knowledge, that one of the reasons you yell and you scream and you have these big headdresses, right? You go into combat to make yourself look bigger, because the hope is that maybe the enemy just runs away. Maybe you don't have to have a battle today. Yeah. Which was way more common in the past. Like there were times where you'd march an army, if it's too big, it's like go, run. We're not going to fight. We don't have to kill today. And the premise is that most soldiers, unless they're psychopaths or they're really, really trained to do it or broken to do it, we'll get into that later, they don't want to kill. They really, really don't want to. And they found this in World War I and World War II especially, but also in the Napoleonic Wars, that regular soldiers having a gun will always aim up. They never aim. Most of them don't aim to shoot the enemy. They will aim up. They'll aim away. They'll do anything. They'll shoot, so they'll look like they're shooting, but they don't really want to take a life. And that's on both sides. That's even World War II, America versus Germany. Both sides weren't shooting to really hit their enemy, especially if they were close. But they wanted to make it. They're hoping that by making a lot of noise, maybe they'll go away.
Yeah.
And then they would interview soldiers too, and they would say this, and they could tell based on the rounds that were shot versus the times that people were hit. They're like, okay, you guys got to be missing on purpose. This doesn't make any sense. Yeah. But and then in times past, maybe you could make an argument, but that's something they found, regardless of who the soldier was, that they didn't really want to shoot to kill. And then they found that the closer you got to the enemy, the harder it was. But I'll just read some other stuff here. And another example he gave was, this is why when you're training people in the military to shoot their guns, this is what the drill is. So it's important to remember that when you're training a soldier in boot camp, or any type of camp, let's say you're just a frontline soldier, you're training them to behave automatically. You're actually not training them to kill. You're training them to shoot a certain way, to do these 3 functions when you're supposed to, and you're trying to make those functions as automatic as possible. I think he gave an example in the book of there was a case of a machine gunner in, I think it was World War One. The guy, you have a machine gunner, then you have the person who's feeding in the bullets. You're a team. When you're a machine gunner or a light machine gunner, you work as kind of a unit. And usually when you're switching out and someone else is swapping in, you kind of pat them on the head, pat them on the top of the helmet to signal that they're supposed to go in. So what had happened was this guy had gotten shot in the head, and as he was falling away from the gun, he was patting the other guy on the head to swap him in. Because the behavior was so drilled into him and so automatic. We'll get into this in the future episode when we're talking about. We had this book by Julian James about the bicameral mind and stuff. We'll talk about that later. But the idea is you can make most of our functions in life aren't conscious; they're just automatic. It's just kind of like a robot doing things. So you can drill into someone so much that when they enter combat, they're just doing it without thinking. They're shooting at a certain way. The more they think about it, the less they can do it. The more conscious they are of their actions, the less they can do it. And you're hoping that you've drilled into them enough that when the time comes, they're just shooting. They're behaving a certain way. They're loading their gun. It's second nature. It's automatic. But they found that even during the Civil War, the American Civil War, they noticed that a lot of soldiers, if given the chance, will kind of wander around and busy themselves. They want to look busy. This is the old thing about working in a restaurant where if you're just walking around with a mop, no one's going to ask you to do anything. So you don't want to shoot the enemy, but oh fuck, you're reloading, you're helping someone, or you look like you're helping someone, you look like you're carrying something. That's what people would rather do than shoot at the enemy. And they realized early on, because they thought, oh, maybe it's that they're actually afraid of shooting. They don't want people to hit them, or they don't want to make themselves known. But they realized when they talked to these soldiers, they're not really afraid of that. Because once you're a soldier, if you've been in combat, you're not really scared for your own life. That kind of gets out of you. That's not shell shock, but that's the idea of like, once you're actually in it, you lose that. You become almost this superhuman where you don't really care if you live or die. You're just, the adrenaline's pumping, you're crazy, your testosterone is up, But what they say is like the reason they kill is because they don't want to let their unit down. They don't want to let their brothers or their teammates down. So they will kill, but they don't want to. But if they do kill, it's not because they're scared for their own life. That's important. And this is borne out by all the evidence. And also, I made a note here, and he talks about this a bit in the book. He doesn't really get into it, where he said, the reason you don't want to kill is usually because the other person is like you, right? So, and this would be evident in the evidence we're pulling from is the Napoleonic Wars, European versus European. World War I is European versus European. Civil War, it's American versus American. And I'd wondered if, fighting a white guy fighting a black person fighting a white guy, is it easier to kill? I think that's the case. And I think he didn't want to say that, but I think in the book, after you read it, it becomes clear that it is easier to kill people from a different ethnicity because you see them less like yourself. And it might be easier to kill. We don't like killing women in the West, but it might be easier for other people to kill them because they're different gender than them or something. So it's not like you see them as subhuman necessarily, but you see them as a different species on the same level. So maybe that can be a cause for alarm about why so many interracial atrocities are committed that you would never commit against your own people. That's something to chew on, something that can make sense. Also, another thing he points out in the book, and it's important to remember this, is that prolonged exposure to combat is largely a modern phenomenon. So it's easy to think of like the Civil War, the Napoleonic Wars, any war throughout history is like, yes, there's always been war, it's always been violence. But the idea of being exposed to war for such long periods of time is insane. That's never happened before. That's what World War I and World War II kind of kicked off. This idea that you can be a soldier for like a month-long combat. And they realized that they built this into the system where it's like every single soldier will go insane unless we send them home for a certain amount of time. That's why you get leave. And the leave isn't to like reward you. The leave is because the militaries of the world figured out that if we don't take these people out of the battlefield, they literally all go insane and they become like bloodthirsty schizophrenics. And that's never happened before. As bad as wars and battles were in the past, in Sparta, the idea was you could have war was actually maybe a lot nicer back then. There were still people who died, but it didn't take as long, and you didn't have enough atrocity machines going. They didn't have gas. It was just swords and fucking spears and arrows. And then there was, if you ran away, there was a lot more you could do to run away, in a sense.
Yeah.
But we are existing in an engine that is designed to drive people into violent schizophrenics in an unprecedented way. And I think, and the argument is that causes more PTSD, and we'll get into it now. Just because I don't know if it's its own point, but the idea was that now more than ever, in the past, you used to have rituals to bring the warrior back into society. And this was all through a time that was the Arc de Triomphe in France, the returning army. There was parades. There's always huge parades and huge feasts. And this wasn't just to celebrate the warrior, to make them feel good. What it was to communicate to the war that all that terrible shit you did was valid and mattered. And we as society thank you.
Yeah,
you're coming back, and you've probably got PTSD. If you just stabbed a bunch of guys, like, holy shit, you're dirty. But here's all your family and your friends saying, you did good. You did a good job. Don't think about it. Say if you did, that helped us. Thank you. And now we're going to figure out a way to let you decompress and come back into society. And the story of Vietnam veterans coming back was they didn't get that. Vietnam veterans, I don't think got a single parade until like the 80s.
Yeah.
If something like 20 years after they got back.
They were like, they got protests, I think, in some cases when they came back.
Yeah. They got piss thrown at them, called baby killers. They got the worst. So they came back with PTSD. The people they came back to said they were the real villains. And there was no decompression there. And that's why the PTSD was so strong with Vietnam veterans. Because they felt like not only did I go through all this terrible shit, it was for nothing. And I would argue that is still what soldiers go through. There is no mechanism in our society to tell the warrior that this thing they're doing matters. And so, like,
well, in
all
fairness,
of them are going to have PTSD.
In fairness, it actually doesn't matter. Like, it seems callous, but I mean, the vast majority of wars that our people have been involved in the past 40, 50 years have been for Israel. Like, so you should be kind of embarrassed for being a soldier right now. I don't know.
I'll give a counterpoint, though. Arguably, every war was like that. Every war was just like for some land baron. But it is true. That is, like, if you are fighting a war now, odds are it's for not even your own country. And that's something even a lot of soldiers we've talked to over the years kind of get that. And they just don't know what to do with it. Or right now they're leaving the military because it's just full of fucking trannies and 4 foot tall women yelling at them. And like, this is a circus.
Yep.
This isn't even a bunch of cool killers anymore. That was what you used to get when you're in the military. At least they're a bunch of lethal, cool guys. And now it's just a bunch of extremely short Hispanic women with their hair pulled back way, way, way too tight. Just they watched a couple movies and they get to yell at men. That's the worst thing you could have done. And just to add on to that, in World War II, around 500,000 soldiers were discharged for psychological reasons. And they found that it was after 30 days of sustained combat is usually the timeline. So you could have 30 days of being in the trenches before your mind just fucking breaks. And they had to evolve this over time. This was World War I too, because it's like we're making an entire generation of people insane. But then you consider the only reason they're sending you away is to bring you right back. So it's just an on and off thing. So that's where you get the idea that, this is just never over. We're going to recycle them as much as possible and give them the minimal amount of time off before we can bring them back. And that's why I said, the vast majority of PTSD has nothing to do with fear of death or injury, because soldiers adapt to that over time. And in fact, another thing they point out was many civilians have PTSD, and they found that there is no difference between, in World War II, as an example, between a soldier who was in World War II and anyone who lived in, for example, Britain during the bombing campaigns or Germany during the bombing campaigns. And that was an interesting thing because people think, oh, PTSD is what soldiers get. No, any population that's involved in a war has PTSD. If you're in a city that's being bombed, or you're in an occupied city where perhaps some bad things are going on, or if you're adjacent, because that is the life of a soldier, just being around when bombs are falling. There's functionally no difference. But they found that it was the exact same rate of PTSD, so it wasn't even everyone. That's I just found that like as an interesting note. But it was like a certain percentage of them got PTSD. And also interestingly, prisoners of war didn't really have as much PTSD. And I'm building to the reason why that is. But they noticed that if you're a prisoner of war in a camp that was being bombed, the prisoners didn't get PTSD, but their guards would. And that the whole reason I'm bringing this together, yeah, and because it has nothing to do with the fear of your life, being threatened. So what they found that the trauma of PTSD seemed to only impact those tasked with confronting and killing humans. So if you felt that you had agency in that situation, so if you were tasked with actually killing someone and the control to do that was in your hands, that is where PTSD came from. And interestingly is that you don't see PTSD in naval combat. You don't see PTSD in the example they gave was machine gunner teams. So if you're on a team of like 4 or 5 people and you're gunning people down, you don't get it because you feel like you're just part of a machine. It's not as direct your agency doing it. But if you have a gun in hand, shoot that guy. That's where PTSD comes from. Not in naval combat. And interestingly, not as much, increasingly over time, not in air combat. So you found PTSD more in pilots where you had to get up close to shoot a plane. And I'm imagining a biplane. I'm imagining the Red Baron here. But there was an idea where you could see the guy. But if you don't see the guy, you don't get PTSD. You could be responsible for sinking a ship of 2,000 people and they all die and you won't get PTSD from it. In fact, they might think it's funny and it's cool. Same thing with naval combat. And the whole thing is, it comes down to personal agency and it comes down to seeing the other person. Those are the two things that really affect people who have to kill. And fighting from a distance empowers both soldiers and civilians. So this is interesting. This is something we talked about before, that this is why America can be so gung-ho about war, because America is really sequestered from the rest of the world. America doesn't really need to fear a land invasion. And once you remove the fear of a land invasion, people get really into war because the number one fear any civilian population has is seeing boots on the ground, is coming face to face with the enemy. But if you were to tell any person, this isn't just Americans, any civilian, if you say, we launched a missile strike that killed 50,000 people, they don't care. They're not emotionally impacted by that. But if you see that happen, or if that's happening in front of you, or if that is going to happen to you, this is the example he gave. If there's a bombing campaign against your city, civilians tend not to care. That's too abstract. That's too distant. But if they see the enemy soldiers marching on the street, that's real. That causes PTSD. Yeah. And it all comes down to seeing the people. That's kind of the thing they're doing. And this is why the further you get from people, it's easier to kill. This is why snipers do so well. Snipers have like a really high kill rate and they don't miss like any shots. But the fact that they're so far away, it becomes just abstracted enough where you can do it. And I'm not saying they're all psychopaths either, because that's not the argument I was making more. I'm just saying that if you have distance, and this is what they noticed with archers, go back to Rome, go back to the Napoleonic Wars, go back to the people manning the artillery. They don't give a shit. They'll kill 20 people at a time. Good job. But it's just the distance that matters. And that's why increasing distance between soldier and the enemy is a very big deal. That's something that militaries around the world are pursuing. That's why drones were such a big thing. It turns out a drone pilot feels nothing. Even if they see it, but it's through kind of I think that will be a key. This is just speculation. I think as drone technology becomes more ubiquitous, and as these attacks are being done more at a distance, you might need people involved in the targeting. But I think there will be a lot of interest in obscuring it just enough. Like, you might be able to get crystal clear imagery of the people you're bombing, but if you kind of make it green and make it obscured a bit, it'll make them easier to pull the trigger. So they might need to handicap the technology itself to make it less realistic, so people will be more willing to do it. Submarines do this all the time. Yeah, you can blow up a fucking cruise ship if it's just a blip on the screen, right? I was going to say, and just to establish this, he says the stages that a human goes through when they kill someone are similar to those who are experiencing a death. And this is really interesting. I like this. So when you kill someone, you go through, when you're told you have to kill someone, actually. So you have to kind of amp yourself up to be a murderer. First of all, you have concern. Like, am I able to do it? Oh my God, what am I going to do? Then there's the actual act of the killing. Then the third phase is you get a hit of exhilaration. Everyone who kills someone gets this. You kill someone. If you stab them with a knife, with a blade, you cut their head off, or you shoot them point blank, you get this rush of exhilaration. Then you get a rush of remorse once you see the dead body on the ground. It's real, and it doesn't look like anything you've seen before. And for those of you out there who've never seen a dead body, I've seen a dead body, you might have as well, but those who haven't seen it, it's very unreal. It doesn't look like how you'd think it would. It's jarring to see a dead body. So then you get this sort of remorse. Then you hit rationalization. The rationalization part is where you have to make sense of what you did. And then the last step is acceptance. Now, if the rationalization fails, that is where PTSD happens. That is specifically the point of you being haunted by it, you coming back to it. You're 87 years old and you're still thinking about this thing you did when you were 21. That is what PTSD is. Now, just to circle back to what we were talking about before, the returning warrior, the returning army, that is what that is all supposed to do. That is the rationalization. You come back to your city, you're like, I've done these terrible things. They say, that was a rational decision you made. And they're like, okay, good. Then you can have acceptance. Even if you regret it later, you have acceptance of it. But you're denied that acceptance if you're denied rationalization, and then you just keep reliving it again and again and again, and you kill yourself. So that is the social function that we need to have these people not end up like the fucking Vietnam veterans, which is terribly tragic. Eventually they did have their parade, 20 years later. But I bet when I say that now, I bet you're all imagining a shitty parade, a parade where the people aren't even into it. It was just something the government did just to like balance their books, right?
Yep.
And I would feel bad. I wouldn't want to participate in that parade if I knew it. It's like, okay, give the baby his bottle. You want your parade. Here's your shitty parade, and you're marching to a bunch of people who don't feel anything. That's a horrible parade to be in, I would imagine. And also during that stage, during the exhilaration stage, that's where you get what's called a combat high. And people who are psychopathic and the people who are just natural born killers, this is where they develop an addiction to killing. This is where you get some people who just never leave the military and just like it because they like the high of killing someone. Now, those people the percentage of those people in an organization might be pretty low. That might be, I think he said maybe around like 1% of soldiers are like that. So it's not like, we're not talking a third of soldiers here who do this stuff. But there's maybe 1% to 2% of soldiers who are just great at killing, and then they get a combat high, and then they just become that. I think that movie Hurt Locker is pretty much like that. That wasn't killing, but that was being addicted to the adrenaline of being close to death, or maybe even seeing death. And then that goes into another fact he had said that I found so fascinating was about bayonets. Now, bayonets, which are the knives you attach to the end of the barrel of the gun. For people who don't know, a bayonet, it's like you got your gun, so you can turn your rifle into essentially a spear. It's intended for close combat, and what they found was that soldiers hate using bayonets. No soldier ever... The incidence of people actually using the bayonet is close to zero. No one likes using it. And in fact, they noticed that if a soldier is in a situation where they have to use the bayonet, they would rather wield their gun like a club and beat the enemy with it.
Yeah.
Or hit them with the butt of the gun and beat them with that. Because there's something about stabbing that no one likes to do. And this goes back to what we were talking about the ancient soldiers who would rather slash than stab. And the reason he says is, and it's interesting, from a psychological perspective, he says that the closer you get in proximity to someone, the harder it is, which is what we just discussed. But he breaks it down into actual physical distances. There's sniper distance, then there's rifle distance, then there's handgun distance, then there's stabbing distance, then there's really, really up close to the point where you need to stab them. And he had made a point that there's sort of an intimacy involved in that. Now, this would be even compounded more when you think back to, imagine a Spartan warrior. Imagine, or a fucking, doesn't need to be that. Imagine a fucking Middle Eastern guy with a scimitar. Now, if you're adept at your sword, if you're a swords person, a swordsman, you know that a sword is an extension of your body. You see the sword or the blade as just a part of your arm. So imagine you're penetrating a man with a part of yourself. Not to sound too homoerotic, but that is what it is. There's an intimacy in using the extension of your body to pierce a man at that close of a level. And there's just a widespread aversion to that, period. And to the point, and he pointed this out, the reason that is, and I'm convinced of this, and this might be, I'm not trying to give people a life hack here, but psychologically, the reason comes down to the face. And one thing they had noticed, once again, this is throughout time, is that the majority of battlefield killings happened when the enemy was retreating.
Now, we can track it throughout history, which the ancient battles were nothing more than great shoving matches. Alexander the Great, according to Ardon Tupik, never lost more than about 700 men total in all of his battles, in which he killed several hundreds of thousands of the enemy. The reason is because he never lost a battle. The great shoving match was not where the killing happened. When one side or the other turned their back and fled, then the killing happened.
People love shooting arrows into the backs of retreating enemies, stabbing them in the back, chasing them down and slaughtering them. That happened more often. And one of the reasons he gives to this is it all comes down to the face. That you hate, no one wants to see the face of the person they're doing, to the point where people who do kill people close up would rather do it from behind. So you'll notice that most executions are done from behind, shooting someone in the back of the head. No one wants to shoot someone looking at them. All throughout history, if you had to hang someone, what would they do? They put a bag over their head. It all comes down to the face. And the moment you remove the face from it, it's really easy to kill people. And again, I'm not saying that as a life/death hack, but that also explains why it's easier to shoot someone in the back. Or there was this one of the, I'm going to try and find his name in editing later, but the pilot who has the most airborne kills, like 300 confirmed kills in an airplane. You would often say the enemy didn't even know I was there. So there is something to ambushing an enemy, shooting them in the back, getting them when they're not noticing. It's easier to do. Stabbing, slitting their throats. They usually say when they try and stab someone, you don't slit their throat. You actually stab them in the kidneys, because I'm going to look that up. Is it the kidneys? I'm pretty sure it is the kidneys, because it's the most painful place to get stabbed. And I'm laughing, but it's true. It's like, it's so painful, your body seizes up and your body freezes. And that's the reason they do it. So keep in mind, if you're going to get stabbed in combat, you will get stabbed in the most painful place that is humanly possible, because it'll quiet you down very fast. But that's the reason they do it. That's why they teach you to do that. That's where they teach you to stab them like on the side in this specific spot. And they even have a graph here. I'm going to edit in to the clip where he's got a graph of physical distance versus resistance to killing. At the easiest, it's max range, just bomber, artillery range. Then it goes right to long range, which is sniper, mid-range rifle. Then there's hand grenade range, close range with the pistol, bayonet range, knife range, hand-to-hand combat range, and at the top is sexual range. But that's the ultimate. The ultimate resistance is to kill a man with your penis.
Based.
Yeah, and but again, remember, there's 1% of guys that will. He's got a part here, like in chapter 6, all factors considered. All of the killing processes examined in this section have the same basic problem. By manipulating variables, modern armies direct the flow of violence, turning killing on and off like a faucet. But this is a delicate and dangerous process. Too much, and you end up with a my lie, which can undermine your efforts. Too little, and your soldiers will be defeated and killed by someone who is more aggressively disposed. An understanding of the physical distance factor addressed in the section Killing and Physical Distance, combined with a study of all of the other personal kill-enabling factors identified thus far, permits us to develop an equation that can represent the total resistance involved in a specific killing circumstance. To recap, the variables represented in our equation include the Milgram factors, the Shallot factors, and the predisposition of the killer. So that's to say, the Milgram factor, which we didn't discuss, well, I'll discuss right now, is essentially, everyone's familiar with the Milgram experiments. Everyone's familiar with the experiment of someone more willing to inflict torture or even kill based off of an authority telling them to. And that's one thing he covers in the book, that soldiers require a legitimate authority, which is why, in my opinion, militaries have the best organizational structure available, which is why successful corporations of years past tended to have the military model. This was very popular with people back from war, but the idea of the legitimacy of your leaders cannot be questioned. So typically the leaders have to be other soldiers who came up through the ranks. You need to be convinced that the guy telling you to kill has experience in killing themselves. And for the record, this is why so many people hate officers. This is why so many people hate this sort of officers who get in through academic means or academic avenues, and why officers typically have the most people rebelling against them, because their legitimacy is always questioned. However, in other military organizations, the guy telling you to kill has killed himself. And so the legitimacy, and they need to be direct. They need to say, you need to kill now, shoot there now. So that is one aspect of getting people to kill, that they not only believe that the authority telling them to kill is legitimate, but also they know that the reason they're killing isn't because they hate their enemy. They don't hate their enemy, usually. They have no emotional investment. And they're not particularly afraid of being killed themselves. If you've been in combat for a long time, that fear goes away. The reason you're killing is because you don't want to let your team down. You love your team so much. You love your guys, you love your squad, and you don't want to let them down, or you don't want to put them in danger. So it's those combinations. And then on the third thing is the predisposition of the individual. Again, some people are just like killing. So, and also the leadership needs to be by you. So one aspect of the demands of authority is the proximity of the being. So the guy telling you to kill has got to be there. It can't be through a radio. It can't be through a screen. So when you're judging your authority, keep that in mind. I'm not trying to tell people an instruction manual here, but the idea of the legitimacy of the authority is also judged by its proximity to the person who is giving the directions. That's an important thing. So, and then group absolution, your identification with the group, called group absolution. Are you a part of this? So the military will be trying to build these up at all times. And then the rest of it, what they're trying to solve for is the predisposition of the killer. What they're trying to solve for is the fact that you actually don't like killing. And the thing is, you don't need to like killing to kill. Previously, it would have been just drilling in your head that just to commit these actions. But if they can, they'll try and create as much distance as possible between you and the actual combat. That's the other thing they'll try and do. Another thing is, this is where you get into atrocities. Like he says that having said all that, you would think that, getting people to commit atrocities on civilians would be good. But he said that's actually very, very bad. Like the My Lai massacre, butchering civilians. He said that has the effect of creating camaraderie in the short term, but in the long term, that really works against your operational intentions. That's the stuff that really stays with people, like the atrocities, and not being able to justify that or accept that later on. That's where the PTSD comes from. Because I remember a long time, I heard this originally from Jordan Peterson. He had an interesting point about PTSD because he was a clinical psychologist, and he said a lot of the people with PTSD, and this I think connects to what we're talking about, they would say that it was their inability to reconcile who they believe they are with what they did. So it's like, I'm not a guy who kills, yet I killed. And it was that dissonance, that discord created between what you actually did and your vision of yourself that creates a lot of PTSD. That makes you feel like, what did I do? I literally don't know what I did, but I did do it. And you can't reconcile that, and that breaks your mind. So that's why being able to reconcile that is so important. And you can't really do that if it's an atrocity unless you're the type of person who just likes atrocities. And that also makes the enemy turn against you. And this is why they recommend against killing prisoners of war. Killing prisoners of war happens all the fucking time, even if they don't call it that. But, the idea is that if your enemy is convinced that you don't take prisoners of war, then they fight harder. Then you've removed the surrender function from them. Like we said, there's fight, flight, posturing, and submission. So if you're too brutal, you remove submission and you remove posturing, and then it's only fight or flight, which is really what you don't want in a combat situation. You kind of do. It would be easier for you if the enemy surrendered,
Yeah.
other than fighting to the last man. But anyway, I would recommend people read this book. Just to summarize briefly, the distances that can be created between a person and killing. He summarizes them here. There's ethnic difference, cultural distance, moral difference, and mechanical difference. That's what enables people to kill. And why I think, the examples we pull from are from Civil War, Napoleonic Wars, World War I, World War II, and that the ethnic and cultural difference actually probably would enable people to kill more. So I just want to add, just maybe put that asterisk there, that having said all this, it seems to really only apply to intra-ethnic struggles. Whereas I think people are more willing to commit atrocities, not just with physical difference and distance, but also cultural and ethnic distance. So let's just keep that, in mind. Mechanical difference is just a thing of technology, But anyway, that's all I had to say. Did you think anything about that?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. It's I kind of see shades of it in management and in a lot of things that, like, once you get attached to people and you get desensitized to things, even aside from violence, the idea that you can become more concerned about the health of the team than about your own safety. And I think this is it's counterintuitive. It's not what you would expect, right? That it's like, oh, well, obviously we're going to have to convince these guys to protect themselves. It's like, no, once they're part of that team, it's interesting. I like it.
Yeah. Well, the idea is, it's like during combat, the last thing that gets people to shoot or kill is hatred of the enemy.
Yeah.
That's not even on their radar. They probably don't even feel any sort of way about what the enemy is or what they're doing or what the grand strategy of their army is. It's all these other very personal, very group-oriented factors. And I like the idea that it makes you think about war differently. It makes you think about what the warrior is, the returning warrior. Perhaps, again, 1% of them are warriors by blood and love to kill, but a lot of these other warriors are people who don't want to be warriors, who desperately need the rest of society to make them not feel bad. Otherwise, they'll destroy themselves, and there must be functions in society to do that. And absent that, we get lost in the mythology of the warrior. We get lost in, like, I'm going to be a warrior. I want to be a killer. It's like, you probably don't. You've only lionize that because you have such incredible distance from it, right? It's like you're the first. You're sitting in a house talking about a war you want to participate in. It's like, okay, you don't realize once you do that, the vast majority of people mentally fracture in this situation once you're there. So realize that if you're out here hoping for a vicious war, you don't get it. You don't get it. That even the people who are from a much more predisposed to war generation, like they didn't want to do it. Once you're there, even when it came to shooting Vietnamese people, look what happened to the last group of people who went and got into what was essentially like a race war with Vietnam. They came back and blew their fucking brains out, and they were probably twice the men that a lot of people on this side calling for war ever were. Let's be honest. So don't go out here saying like I can't wait to kill. That's probably not you. You're probably going to end up killing yourself if you're listen to the people who've done it, listen to the people who've been in the situations, and realize that most of the time people need to be tricked into doing it.
Yeah.
Anyway, that's all I had to say. That's all I had to say about killing today.
Jeez Louise, that was a rough one, but it's good. It's interesting.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.